Peter Parker has been crime-fighting as Spider-Man for around 60 years since his debut in 1962. Over this long tenure as a superhero, Spider-Man has gathered a small army of supervillains in his rogues gallery. Some of these villains, like Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, and Mysterio, have stood the test of time and become almost as iconic as Spider-Man himself. For one reason or another, other villains have fallen into obscurity and are rarely mentioned when discussing Spider-Man's greatest enemies. Maybe their origin story was just too complicated, their abilities were just too uninteresting, or maybe they're just plain weird. Well, that's going to be the exact topic of our video today. We're going to go over the 10 weirdest supervillains that Spider-Man has ever faced and explaining exactly what makes them so strange. We'll be discussing it all, from the tragic to the outdated, and certainly the ridiculous. Although some of Spider-Man's more well-known villains can be kinda out there at times, we'll just be sticking to the really obscure rogues. This means no Vulture, Electro, or Wrecking Crew. That's right, we're scraping the bottom of the barrel for this one. Well, let's get right into it and get weird with some of Spider-Man's Z-tier rogues. This is the top 10 weirdest Spider-Man villains. 10. Screwball.
Oh my god, Spider-Man! I can't thank you enough for the millions of clicks I just got! Wow!
To start things off, let's talk about Spider-Man's most modern archenemy, Screwball. Unlike a lot of Spider-Man's villains, Screwball doesn't break the law for money, revenge, or world domination. She does it for the views. Screwball is a performance artist criminal who live blogs her supervillainy. Although she lacks superpowers or a high-tech power suit, she uses her expert-level parkour skills to pull off heists. Screwball's parkour abilities are so impressive that she has been able to successfully evade Spider-Man. During her criminal activities, Screwball uses a combination of camera crews, GoPros, and drones to film herself and then post the videos online. She maintains an active social media presence. Screwball is solely obsessed with the attention she receives on the internet. So much so that she has publicly challenged Spider-Man to a fight because she knew it would increase traffic to her website. Screwball is essentially the first internet celebrity supervillain. Despite being online so much, Screwball has managed to prevent her real name and identity from being public knowledge. The thing that makes Screwball so strange is that she is a villain that could only exist in the modern era. Without the existence of the internet, there is no Screwball. She's also less of a villain and more like an influencer. Even if Spider-Man wasn't there to stop her crimes, they wouldn't result in much harm. Screwball is kind of strange, but she's a perfect villain for an era where the internet is so important.
You guys know who I am, right? Of course you do. Mind if I live stream on the way to the station?
Officially unfollowed.
Now, before we discuss any other weirdo villains, be sure to subscribe to the channel with notifications on to never miss an upload, and smash that like button for some plot armor today. We've got plenty more entries on our list that will make you wonder why they were even created. 9. Silvermane. It's not uncommon for Spider-Man to go up against mob bosses and organized crime as part of his job as a friendly neighborhood superhero. It's a perfectly familiar sight to see Spider-Man fighting villains like Kingpin. Things get strange when the mob boss starts using supernatural magic and robots like the villain Silvermane. Silvermane started as Silvio Manfredi, an elderly mafia boss of the Mafia organization. Silvio's stark white hair earned him the nickname Silvermane. Despite accumulating a vast fortune and running a successful crime family, Silvermane still wanted to reclaim his lost youth. To do this, Silvermane kidnapped Dr. Kirk Connors, the Lizard, to use an ancient tablet to create a serum of youth. The serum was successful, and Silvermane did de-age to his prime, but that wasn't the end of it. Silvermane continued to de-age until he became nothing but a memory. A death like that would be weird enough to earn Silvermane a place on this list, but the story of Silvermane gets stranger. Eventually, Silvermane was mystically aged back into existence in his 30s. Now that he was back in his prime, Silvermane returned to being a mafia boss. After a series of critical injuries, Silvermane became bedridden and required life support to survive. His injuries also caused the youth serum he ingested to leave his body, aging him back into an old man. After an assassination attempt by Cloak and Dagger, Silvermane's head and vital organs were transferred into a robot body. With this new cybernetic body, Silvermane now had superhuman strength, speed, and durability. Interestingly enough, Silvermane continued to run the Mafia family even after being turned into a cyborg. This means that on multiple occasions, Spider-Man has had to go up against an old man who's essentially just a head attached to a killer robot. Silvermane is definitely one of Spider-Man's stranger enemies, but he's only at the number 9 spot because he still represents a serious threat to the people of New York. His cunning has allowed the Manga family to terrorize and traffic drugs throughout the city. With his robot body, he can now physically compete with Spider-Man in combat and prove a legitimate challenge. The rest of the villains on our list feel more like bad jokes than just bizarre antagonists like Silvermane. 8. Stiltman. It seems like the majority of Spider-Man's rogues are usually some kind of super genius or inventor that uses their intelligence for crime. They usually build powerful and impressive weaponry like wingsuits, robotic arms, and energy blasters. Sometimes they build less impressive things that are more confusing than they are useful. Wilbur Day, aka the Stiltman, fits in that latter category. Wilbur was a scientist employed by a man that invented a hydrolytic ram device. Wilbur stole this technology and used it to engineer a pair of telescopic metal legs that could raise him into the sky. With these robotic legs, Wilbur started his life of crime and became Stiltman. Stiltman's metal legs have a couple of interesting functions. The legs can extend Stiltman hundreds of feet into the air. If the lower section of the legs is damaged, they can be detached and continue to function without issue. Stiltman has also added a silicone coating to his legs so that Spider-Man's webs can't stick to the metal. Despite the many precautions that he's taken, Stiltman is in no way a serious threat. Even within the Marvel Universe, Stiltman is considered a joke by his fellow villains. It's hard not to laugh at the idea of a villain whose entire gimmick is stilts. The first time that Spider-Man ever faced off against Stiltman, the fight ended when Wilbur short-circuited his own legs by firing a ray gun while standing in water. Stiltman has tried multiple times to repair his reputation and prove his villainy, but every attempt has ended in failure. Eventually, Stiltman gave up his life of crime and decided to become a law enforcer for the government during the Civil War storyline. Sadly, he was murdered by the Punisher shortly after. Other individuals did take up the mantle of Stiltman for a time, including a female villain named Lady Stiltman. At a certain point, the Stiltman was resurrected by the Jackal and went back to his stilt-based villainy. Although Wilbur Day may be a laughingstock in the supervillain world, he's earned a place of honor in our hearts. 7. Typeface. Comic book villains are often used to explore real-life issues that readers can relate to, like death, disease, or poverty. Sometimes these explorations can be done in really nuanced and interesting ways, like with Eddie Brock's struggle with cancer. Other times, comic book writers choose to explore traumatic events like the Vietnam War with bizarre villains like Typeface. Typeface originated as Gordon Thomas, a Vietnam veteran whose brother died in the war. When he returned to America, Gordon's wife left him and took their son. Ultimately, he lived a lonely life as a signsmith for Ace Signs. Gordon remained an outcast until a new owner bought Ace Signs and laid him off. With the one thing that brought him joy taken away from him, Gordon decided to become a supervillain and named himself Typeface. Using grease paint, he drew a random assortment of letters on his face and created several alphabet-based weaponry. P's sharpened into daggers, clubs in the shape of commas, and exploding letter blocks that he used as bombs. In addition to using letter-based weapons, Typeface also purposefully uses large words that are more appropriate for a game of Scrabble than regular conversations. The majority of Typeface's time as a villain was spent getting revenge on the man that fired him, George Finch. He kidnapped George and planned on blowing him up with his letter bombs alongside the Ace Signs building. Naturally, Spider-Man showed up to stop him, but ended up getting attacked by a mutant spider hybrid. Seeing Spider-Man in danger reminded Typeface of his brother, so the supervillain decided to help the web slinger defeat the monster. Once that was done, Typeface decided to give up his villain ways, so he and Spider-Man parted on friendly terms. Unfortunately, almost immediately after Spider-Man left, the Ace Signs building exploded thanks to George Finch detonating the explosives. For a while, it was believed that Typeface had died in the explosion, but he had actually survived and became a vigilante. Eventually, Typeface sided against the Superhuman Registration Act during the Civil War timeline and met his end at the hands of Venom, who crushed him to death. Somehow, Typeface lived both a tragic and uneventful life. Although Typeface is a supervillain better suited for a Sesame Street episode than a Superman comic, he still holds the number 7 spot. He was only a villain for maybe 2 days before he became an even more forgettable hero. 6. Mindworm. Our next entry on the list is probably more depressing than it is weird. In the Marvel Universe, most members of the mutant population are persecuted and discriminated against by society. Many of these mutants find acceptance and become protectors of humanity by joining the X-Men. Unfortunately, that wasn't the fate of William Turner, aka Mindworm. William was born a mutant with superhuman telepathic powers. As part of his mutation, William was born with an oversized head, which seemed to grant him enhanced intelligence. Unfortunately, William's mutant abilities have caused him more harm than good. At a young age, William accidentally murdered his own mother by psionically feeding on her. Seeing this sent his father into shock and caused him to run in front of a car. After the death of his parents, William was sent to an orphanage where he was bullied and gained the nickname Mindworm. As Mindworm grew up, he realized that he needed to use his psionic powers to feed off the emotions of those near him in order to survive. He lived in a small shack next to an apartment building where he psionically fed off the tenants, but never to the point of fatal injury. Eventually, Mindworm encountered Spider-Man, who was able to resist his feeding with his mentally tough mind. The two had a brief fight, which Spider-Man won, and Mindworm was sent to prison. Later on, Mindworm realized that his villainous ways were the cause of his trauma over the death of his parents. He befriended Peter and adopted his motto that with great power comes great responsibility. When he was back in the free world, Mindworm attempted to use his mutant powers for good, but was manipulated by criminals who used him to help with a robbery. This caused him to go back to prison, which created a spiral effect. Once out of prison, Mindworm couldn't maintain a job and became homeless. While living on the streets, Mindworm was constantly attacked by local gangs. Because he didn't want to use his powers to cause any more harm, he refused to fight back. Ultimately, Mindworm was killed during one of these attacks. Mindworm was never really a villain and spent most of his life as a victim that even Spider-Man couldn't save. Without a doubt, he's definitely the most tragic villain on our list. 5. Kangaroo. Spider-Man is known for his numerous animal-themed archenemies. Villains like Rhino, Vulture, and Scorpion dress up in animal costumes and cause mayhem throughout New York. Despite how goofy these villains may seem at first glance, they have all proven themselves as serious threats that push Spider-Man to his limits. While those villains have earned their status, other animal-themed rogues like the Kangaroo have never made it out of the silly category. Before he was the Kangaroo, Frank Oliver was a boy who grew up in the Australian outback. As a boy, Frank would spend most of his time studying the kangaroos. He would mimic their behavior and even eat the same food as them. His time with them taught Frank how to fight like a kangaroo. He could leap great distances like a kangaroo and deliver powerful kicks. Eventually, Frank became a boxer, but was banned after critically injuring his opponent. When he came to America, he quickly started his life of crime under the name Kangaroo. As you might expect, Kangaroo never really became an important character in Spider-Man stories. His most interesting event was actually his death. Kangaroo teamed up with an evil surgeon named Jonas Harrow. Dr. Jonas surgically implanted augmentation into the kangaroo that enhanced leg power tremendously. Sadly for Kangaroo, Dr. Harrow also implanted a mind control device that forced him to steal radioactive isotopes. Kangaroo ultimately disintegrated when he entered a radioactive room where the isotopes were kept. Strangely enough, just like when Stiltman died, someone decided to take up the ridiculous mantle of Kangaroo. When Brian Hibbs decided to become the new Kangaroo, he didn't train with marsupials in Australia like Frank. Instead, he used a suit of armor that allowed him to jump great distances. The suit also came with a tail that he could use in close combat and a cannon hidden in his pouch. Although this new Kangaroo had the advantage of a power suit to help him in his crime, he was still just as terrible as Frank. Spider-Man has almost no difficulty whatsoever when he goes up against Kangaroo. Brian is always easily defeated by Spider-Man without much trouble. It seems that the Kangaroo mantle is forever cursed with bad luck and a loser status. 4. Walrus. The supervillains that take up the Kangaroo mantle may be terrible at their job, but there are far worse animal-themed villains out there. And the Walrus is definitely at the bottom of that list. Most of the animal villains have at least some level of skill that they bring to their criminal personas. They're either genius inventors, expert fighters, or highly skilled thieves, but the Walrus has none of that. Before he became the Walrus, Hubert Carpenter was a dim-witted cab driver who lived with his uncle Humbert. His uncle was actually a mad scientist that had been attempting to give Hubert superhuman abilities for 10 years. Over that duration, his uncle had failed to give him the powers of multiple animals in alphabetical order. Humbert even tried to give his nephew the powers of a turkey. Finally, they succeeded when they were on the letter W. The last experiment mostly resulted in him getting super strength and enhanced durability. According to Hubert himself, he has the proportionate strength, speed, and agility of a walrus. While walruses are certainly strong, they definitely aren't known for their speed and agility on land, which would mean that Hubert is technically slower than the average human. With his newfound powers, Hubert didn't have any grand plans of world domination or the sort. All he wanted to do was be the best mass destructionist in the world. When he first received his powers, Walrus spent his time randomly vandalizing property. Because Walrus is so slow-witted, it's incredibly easy to manipulate him. Deadpool once tricked him into believing that he had been chosen by a magical hammer. Unknown to Deadpool, the hammer was actually magical, making him far stronger than he would be normally when exposed to the full moon. The Walrus's magical powers were short-lived though when Deadpool lured him into a basement and shot him. The Walrus may be Spider-Man's dumbest villain, but he's not quite the weirdest. We still have a few more rogues to go over before we unveil the owner of that title. 3. Swarm. So far, most of the villains on our list have followed a similar pattern. Most of them used to be regular people that chose to become supervillains and base their entire criminal persona on a bizarre gimmick. But for the number 3 spot, we have a villain that truly breaks the mold. Our third weirdest villain isn't human, but a swarm of living bees. At the end of World War II, a Nazi scientist named Fritz von Meyer fled Germany and moved to South America. While there, he continued his research on toxic poisons and his main source of interest, killer bees. During his research, he discovered a special hive of bees that show no fear and high intelligence. While attempting to turn the hive into killing machines, Fritz lost control and was murdered by the bees. Although Fritz's physical body was killed, his consciousness survived and was dispersed into the hive. Fritz was now a living swarm of mutated killer bees, and thus Swarm was born. Because Swarm lacks a singular physical body, he's incredibly difficult to kill. His mind is spread across millions of bees that are constantly reproducing. As long as any of those bees survive, Swarm can always return. Swarm also has the ability to mutate bees to gigantic sizes. He usually rides a massive queen bee into battle. Despite Swarm's high durability and genius intelligence, he has several fairly obvious weaknesses that Spider-Man often exploits. Because Swarm is made of bees, he's extremely vulnerable to insecticides and repellents that cause him intense pain. Swarm also needs a queen bee to form around. If the queen is separated from the swarm, all of his bees will follow her for hundreds of miles. Capturing the queen bee will also severely hamper his fighting abilities. Strangely enough, Swarm has almost the exact same origin as Spider-Man from Earth 11580. In this universe, Peter Parker wasn't bitten by a radioactive spider. Instead, he fell into a colony of radioactive spiders that ate him alive. Just like with Swarm, Peter's consciousness was absorbed by the spiders, forming a singular hive mind that believed itself to be Peter Parker. This hive mind went on to become the superhero Spider-Man. Maybe the similarity between the two characters is supposed to show them that in another world, the Swarm could have been a hero. Or maybe Peter could have been a Nazi scientist. Let's not think about it too hard. 2. Big Wheel. There's a long history of supervillains who incorporate their real name into their villain identity. This usually results in interesting bad guys who are intimidating and powerful. Victor Von Doom becomes Dr. Doom, for example. Sometimes, though, the result is less spectacular and more strange than anything else. Jackson Wheel is a perfect example of the latter. Jackson Wheel began as a corrupt businessman that was stealing money from his company. To avoid being incriminated, Jackson hired the Rocket Racer, a criminal that used a rocket-powered skateboard to steal documents connecting him to the crime. The racer fulfilled his end of the bargain, but held onto one of the documents so that he could extort even more money from Jackson. This drove Jackson to suicide, but he was saved by the racer, who swore to stalk Jackson until he was paid. Jackson learned that the racer's equipment was created by another villain called the Tinker. He hired the Tinker to build him a weapon that could take out the racer. The Tinker was inspired by Jackson's last name, Wheel, and created a giant massive armored wheel outfitted with machine guns and rocket launchers. This strange weapon was named the Big Wheel, which Jackson also used as his villain name. The big wheel vehicle is a rather powerful machine. It's capable of crushing cars with ease, withstanding rocket fire, and moving vertically up buildings. Like many of the other villains on this list, Big Wheel's first fight against Spider-Man was rather lackluster. While trying to run over the racer, Big Wheel accidentally drove off a building and crashed into the Hudson River. Big Wheel survived his brief dive into the river and began a sporadic career of crime which always failed. Erratically, Big Wheel has switched between supervillain, would-be hero, and even a monster truck driver for a time. As hard as it may be to believe even the circular crushing king Big Wheel isn't the strangest villain that Spider-Man has ever faced, we've got one more bad guy that truly boggles the mind and makes you wonder if the Spider-Man writers just ran out of ideas. 1. The Wall. It's honestly difficult to even introduce our final villain, so we'll just come out and say it. Spider-Man once fought a man that was turned into a wall. When we say wall, we don't mean a man dressed as a wall or using a suit of armor in the shape of a wall. We mean an actual living brick wall. This villain is the perfect combination of both tragedy and bizarreness, which makes him an excellent candidate for the weirdest villain. This strange amalgamation of man and wall began as Joshua Waldemeier, a normal bricklayer and student. While on the job, Joshua was caught in an explosion that caused a wall to fall on top of him. Joshua managed to survive the accident, but was bonded with the wall, transforming him into a living wall. Joshua was now just a brick wall with legs and a face. He didn't even have arms anymore. Naturally, being in this new body sent the wall into a rage. He used his new powers to unleash mayhem on a New York Mets game where he knocked out players and the umpire. Eventually, Spider-Man showed up to take the wall down, but most of his attacks had no effect. Being a wall allowed Joshua to ignore most damage. The wall is a strange enough villain as is, but his conflict with Spider-Man ended even weirder. When the game's umpire woke up, he kicked both Spider-Man and the wall out of the game. The two of them went to a nearby park where they apparently talked things out. A pretty anticlimactic ending, and there's no other information about the wall either. This is his first and only appearance in not only Spider-Man comics, but all Marvel comics. It's probably for the best that the wall never showed up again, but it is interesting to think about Joshua spending the rest of his life as a wall. Well, that's it! What do you think of our ranking? Is there a villain out there weirder than the wall that we missed? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching to the end. Until next time, keep that plot armor on you. I'm Alexandra Macedo. Have a great day. Goodbye.